Inside box 26 of my father's company archives, between the 5th and 6th folder, I found a yellowed sticky note. 6 words in his handwriting. Use the March signature page. That was the proof. The building was empty. A Saturday afternoon, just me and 41 boxes he never believed I'd open. I sealed it in an evidence sleeve with shaking hands and called my lawyer. She said 2 words. Pack the suitcases. But let me go back to the beginning, because this story started 10 years before I found that note. I was 36 years old, the founder of a clinical research organization, valued at $1.4 billion, and I was standing in my Austin headquarters, watching my company's name scroll across a Bloomberg terminal, when my mother texted me for the first time in 10 months. 3 words. Family dinner, no excuses. No congratulations. No, I saw the news. No, I'm proud of you, Gemma. Just a summons, the way you'd recall a piece of equipment that had been out on loan too long. My mother, Lorraine Aldrich, 65 years old, a homemaker and family bookkeeper from Fort Smith, Arkansas, had watched her youngest daughter's company hit a valuation most people can't even pronounce, and her only response was a dinner invitation that read like a subpoena. Around me, my team was popping champagne. Someone had ordered a sheet cake with the company logo on it, the new carpet smell of our headquarters mixed with uncorked brut, and my phone buzzed against my palm like a wasp trapped under glass. I read the text twice, then I set the phone face down on my desk and did not pick it up again for 3 hours. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly before we go any further. 10 years before that text arrived, my parents destroyed my first company. My father used a convertible note he called a gift to seize controlling interest in the lab compliance consultancy I had built from nothing. He removed me in a 20-minute shareholder meeting held at our family dining table, installed my older sister as interim president, and told the entire town of Fort Smith that I had walked away. My mother sat at the end of that table folding meeting minutes she never read. She knew. They all knew. Let me tell you what 10 years of silence sounds like when it finally breaks. It sounds like 3 words on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered without warmth, without apology, without even the courtesy of acknowledging what they took. So when that text arrived, I did not feel anger. Anger is what you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic. What I felt was something colder and much more useful. I felt the click of a mechanism engaging, a lock turning, a circuit closing, a sequence I had been building for longer than my mother could possibly imagine. I left the champagne untouched. I never drink at celebrations. That is a habit I developed after losing my first company, and it is not a habit I intend to explain right now. I said the right things to my team, smiled in the right places, stayed long enough to be present, but not so long that anyone would notice I was already somewhere else in my head. By 6 o'clock, the office was quiet. By 7, I was home. My apartment smelled like nothing. I keep it that way. No candles, no diffusers, no evidence that a human being lives there beyond a bed, a coffee maker, and a closet with 2 suitcases that had been packed since January. The champagne my COO had sent over sat sweating on the kitchen counter. I walked past it without stopping. I opened the closet. The suitcases were exactly where I had left them 5 months ago. 1 black, 1 gray. Both carry-on size. Both heavier than they looked. The black suitcase held the past. 40 original letters bearing a forged copy of my signature. Every one of them a fraud my father had orchestrated to transfer my clients to my sister's company. A yellowed sticky note in my father's handwriting that read, "Use the March signature page," with his initials in the corner. A stack of envelopes pre-addressed in my mother's meticulous cursive. Backup envelopes, proof she was not a bystander, but a co-author. And a notarized sworn statement from a retired federal compliance clerk who had kept a copy of the internal email directing the forgery, because 40 years of filing records had taught him to recognize when something was about to disappear. The gray suitcase held the future. Acquisition documents showing that a shell company called Quarry Creek Holdings my shell company, had purchased 70% of my sister's failing business 6 months earlier for $2.4 million. An employee ownership trust that would transfer that stake to the 34 people who had been keeping my stolen protocols running for a decade. And a college fund for a 9-year-old girl named Rin who drew horses on her math homework and had no idea her aunt existed. I had been preparing for that dinner since the acquisition closed in January. 5 months of waiting, 10 years of building, and not one person in Fort Smith, Arkansas, not my father, not my mother, and especially not my sister, had any idea what I was carrying. I set both suitcases on the bed, black on the left, gray on the right, past and future, side by side on a queen-size mattress in an apartment that smelled like nothing. You want to know what happened at that dinner table? So did they. But to understand what those suitcases mean, to understand why I packed one with proof of a crime and the other with paperwork designed to protect people who had never protected me, you need to go back 13 years to a rented lab in Fort Smith that smelled like bleach and futures, and a father who handed me a contract and called it a gift. 13 years before those suitcases, before the valuation and the silence and the text that read like a warrant, I was 23 years old, and the first lab I ever worked in smelled like bleach and futures. It was a 2-room rental off Rogers Avenue in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder than my confidence. The landlord had previously rented the space to a dog groomer, and no matter how much I scrubbed the floors, the faint ghost of wet terrier hung in the corners when it rained. I had a folding table, a laptop with a cracked hinge, and a whiteboard I had bought at an office supply store for $37. That whiteboard would follow me for the next 13 years. It is the only object from Fort Smith that survived. I launched a lab compliance consultancy in the spring of 2011 because I understood one thing nobody else in my family did. Small clinics across western Arkansas were 6 months behind on their federal compliance paperwork, and most of them did not know it. I cold called every veterinary clinic, every independent pathology lab, every dental office with an autoclave and a prayer. Most of them hung up. A few listened. One said yes. I drove to that first client's office with a 40-page compliance audit I had written by hand over a weekend. I shook the office manager's hand and said, "Your lab protocols are 6 months out of compliance. I can fix that in 30 days. She looked at me like I was either brilliant or delusional, and then she signed a contract for $400 a month. I wrote her name on the whiteboard in blue dry erase marker when I got back to the lab. I stood there looking at it for a long time. One name, one client, proof that someone trusted me. You need to understand something about my father before we go any further. Vernon Aldrich, 67 years old, had run Aldrich Scientific Supply out of a warehouse on Route 71 for 4 decades. Lab equipment distribution, the kind of business that runs on bulk orders and handshake deals, and the iron bookkeeping his own father had taught him. He was a man who knew the price of everything in his inventory down to the penny, and he applied that same arithmetic to his family. He did not give anything without keeping a receipt. He did not invest in anything without expecting a return. And when his youngest daughter started building something from a blank page, something nobody in the Aldrich family had ever done, because they inherited, they did not invent, he watched the way a man watches a stock ticker. Not with pride, with calculation. I built that consultancy one client at a time. I wrote every new name on the whiteboard and erased the board every quarter to start the count again, because I wanted to prove to myself that the growth was real and repeatable. By the end of 2011, I had 11 clients. By the middle of 2012, I had 19. Nobody helped me. Nobody invested. I paid myself last every month, and I slept on an air mattress in the back room of the lab twice a week, because the drive home was 40 minutes I could not afford to waste. And then my father called. Not in 2011, not when I was starting out. He called in June of 2024, 13 years later, On the same day, my company's name scrolled across a financial news terminal in Austin. I was standing in my apartment, still wearing the same clothes from the office celebration I had not participated in, when his number lit up my phone. That phone call was not a bridge. It was a billing statement 13 years in the making. "I saw the news," he said, and his voice had that deliberate warmth to it, the kind that sounds like a banker's handshake feels. Firm, practiced, and designed to make you forget you are being measured. "Your mother and I always knew you had it in you. That's Aldrich blood." I held the phone to my ear and said nothing. I could hear the television in the background. I could hear my mother's footsteps somewhere behind him. I drank my cold coffee and waited. "You know," he said, and there was a pause, the kind of pause a man leaves when he is about to say the thing he actually called to say. Real talent means knowing when to share with the people who made it possible. 3 words buried in the compliment, "share with the people." That was not pride talking. That was an invoice. "I'll see you at dinner, Dad," I said. I kept my voice level. I kept my breathing even. I said goodbye and set the phone on the counter next to the untouched champagne, and I stood very still for a long time. I was not congratulating me. He was appraising me. The same way he had appraised me 13 years ago when I was 23 and hungry and too young to know the difference between a father's pride and a father's appetite. When he sat across from me at our family dining table and slid a contract across the wood and smiled and called it a gift. I knew the difference now. And in 3 days, I was going to sit at that same table and show him exactly how well I had learned to read the fine print. The first time my father slid a contract across that dining table, it was the spring of 2011, and I had been running my consultancy for 5 months, 11 pages. He pushed them toward me the same way he passed the salt, like it cost him nothing. $350,000, he said, tapping the first page with his index finger. His reading glasses sat low on his nose. The dining room smelled the way it always did. Old wood polish, my mother's roast cooling on the kitchen counter, and something sweeter underneath that I now understand was the scent of a trap being baited. You don't go to a bank when your family believes in you. This is what fathers do. My mother stood in this doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, refilling a pitcher of sweet tea that nobody had asked for. She did not sit down. She did not speak. She just hovered, the way a stagehand hovers in the wings during someone else's performance. I looked at the contract. The cover page said, "Convertible promissory note," in a typeface that belonged in a boardroom, not a family kitchen. The number was too round. The terms ran 11 pages when a simple loan between father and daughter could have been handled in 2. And his smile, I remember this clearly, did not reach past his teeth. "It's a convertible note," he said, as though I had asked for a definition. "Standard. Your company grows. I convert to equity or you buy me out. Either way, we both win." Here is the thing about a convertible note from your own father. You read the love before you read the fine print. You see the number and you think about what it could build. A real lab, proper equipment, a second hire, an autoclave that does not sound like it is dying every time you run a cycle. You think about the fact that your father, who has never once told you he is proud of you using those exact words, is now sitting across a table offering you proof of belief in a language he actually speaks. Money. So you start reading the terms with your heart before your head catches up. I read the first 6 pages at the table while he watched. Repayment schedule, interest rate, conversion ratio. All of it was firm but not unreasonable. I clicked the pen cap in my left hand, a nervous habit I have never been able to break, and I almost turned to the signature page. Almost. Page 7 is where the contract stopped being a gift and started being a mechanism. The clause was buried in the middle of a paragraph about default provisions. Upon material change in business conditions, as determined at the sole discretion of the note holder, the outstanding principal and accrued interest shall become immediately due and payable in full. I read it twice. Then I looked up. "What's this clause on page 7?" I said. "Acceleration upon material change?" My father took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He did not look at the page. He did not need to. "Boilerplate," he said. "The lawyer insists. I've never triggered one in 40 years of business." He said it too fast. The way you answer a question you have rehearsed. The way a man responds when he expected the question and prepared a dismissal in advance. I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite alarm, not quite recognition, but the beginning of a frequency I would learn to hear very clearly over the next 3 years. The sound of my father lying to me with complete composure. My mother poured more sweet tea into my glass. It was already full. The overflow pooled on the wood, and she wiped it with a cloth she had been holding the entire time, as if she had anticipated the spill. I watched her wipe the table, and I thought about how a woman who anticipates spills is a woman who has been cleaning up after messes for a very long time. Have you ever watched someone lie to you and known it? Felt it in the base of your spine, like a dropped note in a song, and signed anyway, because the alternative was calling your father a liar at his own dining table? I did not sign that night. I told him I wanted to take it home and read it one more time. He smiled and said, "Of course, take your time." But his fingers tapped the table twice after he said it, and I have worked with enough lab technicians to know what involuntary motor response looks like when someone's patience is performing. I drove home with this contract on the passenger seat. I sat at my folding table in the lab, the same table where I had written my first client's name on the whiteboard 5 months earlier, and I read page 7 over and over until 2 in the morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. My coffee went cold. The acceleration clause stared back at me like something patient and coiled. I did not sign it, not yet. Instead, I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. My own, not my father's. And I asked her a question that would take 3 years to fully answer. What happens if he actually pulls this trigger? My lawyer answered that 2 a.m. question 3 days later in her office on the south side of Fort Smith, and she answered it by reading the acceleration clause out loud twice, and then setting the contract down on her desk like it might bite her. Sabine Gallagher was 44 years old and had spent the previous decade closing distressed biotech acquisitions. The kind of deals where companies are bought for parts and the founders leave with nothing but a non-disclosure agreement and a parking lot cry. She was not the kind of attorney who flinched at aggressive contract language. She had built a career on it. So when she set my father's contract down and looked at me the way a doctor looks at a scan, they wish they did not have to explain. I understood that page 7 was worse than I thought. "This isn't a father's loan," she said. She had highlighted the acceleration clause in yellow, and the ink had bled through to the other side of the page. "This is a takeover instrument with a family discount." He said it was boilerplate, I told her. Boilerplate doesn't let someone seize 60% of your company over a missed quarter. She tapped her pen against the margin of the page. "The material change trigger is so vague he could invoke it because you sneezed wrong in a board meeting. And the cure period? 10 days? That's not a grace period. That's a countdown." She recommended I refuse to sign without a buyback ceiling and a 60-day cure window. She said it clearly, and she said it twice. I sat in her office drinking black coffee I never finished, and I listened to every word. I want you to remember a name, Leland Hatch, because he matters again before this story ends. Leland Hatch was my father's longtime corporate attorney. He practiced from a wood-paneled office on Towson Avenue where he had drafted contracts for Aldrich Scientific Supply for 20 years. His bar certificate hung slightly crooked on the wall behind his desk, and his office smelled like old leather and the particular kind of dust that accumulates in rooms where men draft documents they hope will never be read aloud in court. I went to see him the next afternoon. I did not call ahead. I walked in, told his receptionist I was Vernon Aldrich's daughter, and waited 11 minutes in a chair that creaked every time I shifted my weight. When he came out, he looked the way a man looks at a consequence he has been expecting. I did not tell him I had hired my own lawyer. I did not tell him what Sabine had said. I simply asked him, as politely and directly as I could manage, whether he had any concerns about the acceleration terms in the note he had drafted for my father. Hatch sat behind his desk and folded his hands. His desk clock ticked in the silence between us. I was a careful man, careful the way people are when they have spent decades standing close to power without ever holding it themselves. I draft what my clients ask for, he said. I did advise your father that the acceleration terms were. He paused, and in that pause I heard everything his next word would try to soften. Aggressive. Did he change them? He said his daughter would never give him a reason to use them. I gripped the armrest of the chair and felt the old leather creak under my fingers. His daughter would never give him a reason. That sentence was not reassurance. It was architecture. My father had designed a weapon and justified it by saying the target would never be worth shooting. And Hatch had drafted the weapon, warned against it, been overruled, and filed it anyway. His discomfort was genuine. His compliance was also genuine. Both things were true, and neither one of them protected me. I drove home from Hatch's office that afternoon, knowing two things with absolute certainty. First, the contract was a weapon. My father had built it deliberately, over the objections of his own attorney, with terms designed to give him control at the moment of his choosing. Second, he had looked me in the eye across our family dining table and called it a gift. So I signed it. I know what you are thinking. Two lawyers, two separate professionals with no connection to each other, had both told me the contract was predatory. One called it a takeover instrument. The other admitted the man who commissioned it had been warned and refused to change a word. And I drove home, sat at my folding table under the buzzing fluorescent lights, and signed page 11. Not because I trusted my father. I had stopped trusting him somewhere between his rehearsed answer about boilerplate and Hatch's careful pause before the word aggressive. I signed because I was 23 years old, with 11 clients, and a company that could not grow past a 2-room rental without capital. I signed because the alternative was going to a bank that would have said no. And I signed because some part of me, the part that still remembered birthday cards and fishing trips, and the sound of his voice reading to me when I was small, still believed I could outrun the clause before he ever pulled the trigger. That was the last time I was wrong about my father. And it was the most expensive mistake I have ever made. Before the contract became a weapon, before any of what came next. There was one summer when my sister and I worked the same bench, and it was the closest thing to partnership I have ever felt with anyone in my family. July 2012. My older sister, Nadine Aldrich Pruitt, showed up at my rented lab in Fort Smith on a Tuesday morning wearing cut-off shorts and a Razorbacks tee, looking 32 instead of the 40 she actually was. She was married to Doug Pruitt, a regional sales manager for a medical device company whose territory had been shrinking for 2 years running. She said she wanted to learn the business. What she really wanted, I think, was to feel competent at something again. She picked up my sample log and held it like a menu she could not quite read. Curious, willing, and completely unaware that our father had already assigned her a role in a plan she had never been told about. I handed her a pair of gloves and showed her how to calibrate a pH meter. The beep of the calibration confirmation became our metronome for the week. She reorganized my chaotic filing system while I ran compliance audits at the bench, and by Wednesday we had developed the kind of shorthand that only siblings can build. Half sentences, raised eyebrows, inside jokes scribbled on reagent labels that would have made no sense to anyone else. We ate gas station tacos on the loading dock at lunch, sitting on the concrete with warm foil on our bare knees. The summer heat mixed isopropanol with cheap salsa into a smell I can still recall if I close my eyes. We drank Diet Dr. Pepper from cans that sweated faster than we could drink them. I need you to remember this moment. The two of us on that loading dock, laughing, bumping elbows, because it is the last time we were on the same side. You actually built this? Nadine said on Thursday afternoon, looking around the lab with an expression I had never seen her wear before. It was not jealousy. It was awe. From nothing? I didn't know you had all this in you. Stay the rest of the month, I told her. I'll teach you everything. We could do this together. She laughed and shook her head. Mom would lose her mind if both her daughters smelled like isopropanol at Thanksgiving. But I could see it. The flicker behind her eyes. The possibility taking shape. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to build something the way I had built something. And if our father had been a different man, she might have. That same evening, I was at my parents' house on Garrison Avenue for dinner. Nadine had gone home early. I was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard my father's voice coming through the screen door to the back porch. Low, deliberate, the cadence he used for business calls, not family conversations. I was not supposed to hear it. But hallways carry voices, and fathers forget that doors do not close themselves. The lab is the growth asset, he was saying to someone on the other end of the line. I could not tell if it was a business associate or my mother on her cell phone from the other room. It did not matter. What mattered was the language. She's got a mind of her own, which makes her harder to manage. But Nadine's the real investment. She'll do what she's told and be grateful for it. I pressed my hand against the doorframe. The wood was cool under my fingers. My father's silhouette sat in the porch chair, phone to his ear, completely at ease. The note's the leash, he said. She can run as fast as she wants. I just shorten the rope whenever I need to. The leash. He called the contract I had signed 3 months earlier. The document 2 lawyers had warned me about. The one I had convinced myself I could outrun. The leash. And he said it the way he would describe a piece of equipment in his warehouse. Functional, reliable, already paid for. My father did not raise daughters. He maintained a portfolio. 1 asset for growth, 1 asset for compliance, and the convertible note was not capital. It was a control mechanism he could tighten from 400 miles away anytime the growth asset got too independent. I stood in that hallway long enough to hear him say Nadine's name 2 more times. Both times in the same register he used for inventory, margins, positioning, liability exposure. She was not his favorite. She was his most controllable. There is a difference, and it is the cruelest one I know. I walked back to the guest room without making a sound. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed where I had slept since I was 6 years old, and I pressed my palms flat against the quilt my mother had sewn the year I started kindergarten, and I breathed until my hands stopped shaking. The note was the leash. My sister was the real investment, and the worst part? The part that kept me awake until 3 in the morning and every night for the next 18 months, was that Nadine had no idea. She was on that loading dock eating tacos and dreaming about building something, and she did not know that our father had already decided what she would build, and for whom, and at whose expense. Within 18 months, he would pull the trigger. And my sister would be the one holding the gun. 18 months after I heard my father call the contract a leash, he pulled it. The call came on a Tuesday in March 2014. I was in the lab running a calibration sequence when my phone lit up with the word Dad on a cracked screen. I almost let it ring. I wish I had. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was. He said, 30 days, full balance. That's what the contract says, and that's what I'm exercising. I set the calibration probe down and pressed the phone harder against my ear, as though better contact with the speaker might change the words coming through it. The lab smelled like solvent and the particular sharp tang that stress puts on your own skin when your body understands something before your mind catches up. Dad, I can do 70% by April if you just read paragraph 6, subsection C, then call your lawyer. He hung up before I finished the sentence. The click was precise, not angry, measured. the sound of a man executing a plan on schedule. Every pause during that call had been in exactly the right place. He had rehearsed this. He had rehearsed ending his daughter's company the way a man rehearses a presentation. Timing, tone, exit. I stood in my lab holding a dead phone, and I understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives too late to be useful, that the conversation I had overheard on the porch in the summer of 2012 had not been speculation. It had been a timeline, the leash, the rope, the shortening. This was the tug. "You are waiting for me to say," I called my mother. I did not. My mother already knew. She had known about every piece of this, the note, the clause, the timing, and she had poured sweet tea over it and wiped the table clean. Calling Lorraine would have been like calling the weather to complain about rain. I called Sabine instead. She answered on the first ring, and when I told her what had happened, she was quiet for 4 seconds, which, if you know Sabine, is the equivalent of someone else screaming. Then she said, "How much can you pull together?" That question became my entire life for the next 48 hours. I emptied the business savings account. $112,000. I cashed out a small retirement fund I had started the year before, penalty, taxes, and all, for another $31,000. I called every client who owed an outstanding invoice and asked, as professionally as I could manage with my hands shaking, whether they could pay early. Some did. Most could not. I sold the backup centrifuge to a vet clinic in Fayetteville for $8,000. It was worth $30,000. I sold the company van to a used car lot on Midland Boulevard for $4,000. I called in every favor, every outstanding balance, every loose dollar I had ever let slide, because I believed in being generous with people who were building something too. The centrifuge went for $8,000. I want you to sit with that. An instrument I had saved for over a year, purchased with money I had earned one compliance audit at a time, sold for a quarter of its value to a man who knew I was desperate, and priced accordingly. By Thursday evening, I sat at my folding table with a legal pad and a calculator and a cup of coffee I had reheated twice until it tasted like bitter metal. I added the column one more time. The number did not change. $290,000. Every liquid asset I owned on earth, every favor called in, every piece of equipment I could sell without shutting down operations entirely. $290,000, and the note demanded the full balance. I was $60,000 short. 27 days left. $60,000 between me and losing controlling interest in the company I had built from a 2-room rental and a $37 whiteboard. And I knew, the way you know a storm is coming by the pressure change in your knees before the sky even darkens, that my father had timed this perfectly. He knew my cash flow. He knew my billing cycles. He knew exactly which month would leave me close enough to taste survival and far enough to choke on the gap. The distance between what I had and what I owed was not an accident. It was engineering. $60,000. I stared at the number on the legal pad until the ink blurred. I pressed my pen into the paper hard enough to dent the invoice underneath it. And I thought about every person in Fort Smith who might have that kind of money available on 27 days' notice. The list was short. The list was, in fact, one name long. You know who had that kind of cash sitting available? So did I. And she was the last person on earth I wanted to owe anything to. But desperation has a way of rearranging your principles in order of what you can afford to lose, and I could not afford to lose this company. Not to him. Not after what I had heard him call it. Not after the leash. I picked up my phone, scrolled to a number I had not dialed in 2 years, and stared at the screen until the backlight dimmed. 27 days. $60,000. And one call I swore I would never make. I never made that call. Before I could decide whether to swallow my pride or choke on it, something else arrived. Something so ordinary it almost disappeared into the pile of mail on my lab bench. An envelope from my father's office. Aldrich Scientific letterhead. Single page inside. A checkbox form about updated liability insurance tied to the convertible note. The kind of administrative housekeeping that exists only to prove someone filed it. I read every line, twice. I held it up to the fluorescent light as though the paper itself might be hiding something between the fibers. It was exactly what it said it was. An insurance compliance update. Benign, boring. One signature line at the bottom. I signed it at the lab bench without sitting down. The pen scratched across the page, and I set it in the outgoing mail tray and did not think about it again for 10 years. That was the genius of it. My father did not need me to sign a lie. He needed me to sign something something I would read carefully, something that would pass scrutiny, something genuine, so that the signature would look exactly like every other signature I had ever put on paper. Because that signature, that one real signature on that one real page, was going to be digitally scanned and pasted onto 40 letters I never wrote. 40 client transfer letters directing every account I had built to a company that did not yet exist, under a name I would not learn for another 3 weeks. I want you to remember that signature. You are going to see it again, 40 times. On letters I never authorized, never read, and never would have sent. One page, one real signature, 40 forgeries, and I handed it over myself because it was exactly what it appeared to be. That is the part that still keeps me up at night. Not that my father forged my name, that he made me provide the original. 3 weeks later, in April, a certified letter arrived at the lab. The green return receipt card was stuck to the front, and I had to sign for it at the door, which meant I signed my name twice in 1 month for documents. I tore the envelope open standing in the doorway. The letter was on Leland Hatch's firm letterhead. Not my father's name, not Aldrich Scientific, Hatch's office, Towson Avenue, the same wood-paneled room where I had sat 2 years earlier and listened to a careful man tell me he had been overruled. The language was surgical. Failure to remit the outstanding balance within 10 business days would result in automatic conversion of the note to controlling equity per the clause I had flagged on page 7 3 years ago. The clause my father had called boilerplate. The clause his own lawyer had called aggressive. It was now a certified letter with a 10-day fuse. A certified letter is just a piece of paper that makes you sign for your own execution. My father's name appeared nowhere in the document. Not in the header, not in the body, not in the signature block. Hatch signed it. The firm's address was listed as the point of contact. Vernon Aldrich had ended his daughter's company the way you cancel a magazine subscription, through an administrative office, on letterhead, without ever putting his own hand on the weapon. I sat on the lab stool with the letter flat on the bench, and I read it 3 more times. The toner smelled warm, as though it had just come off a printer. The cardstock was smooth between my fingers, which were shaking in a way I could not control no matter how many times I pressed my palms flat against the bench surface. The math had not changed. I had gathered every dollar I could find over the previous weeks. The number was still the same, and now the window had shrunk from 27 days to 10. 10 business days. 2 calendar weeks. The difference between owning my company and watching my father take 60% of it was a gap I had already failed to close when I had nearly a month. Now I had half that. 10 business days. Have you ever tried to find that kind of money in 10 business days? I had already sold every piece of equipment I could spare. I had already cashed out every account with my name on it. I had already called every client who owed me an outstanding balance. There was nothing left to liquidate. There was no one left to call. I set the certified letter on the bench next to the outgoing mail tray, the same tray where I had dropped the insurance addendum 3 weeks earlier, the form with the signature that was, at that very moment, being scanned and duplicated in my father's office. And I stared at the wall and tried to breathe. And then my phone buzzed. A text from Nadine, my sister, who had eaten tacos with me on the loading dock 2 summers ago. My sister, whose name my father had spoken into the phone like an inventory item. My sister, who I had not heard from in 4 months. "Hey, Dad says you might need help. Can I come by the lab tomorrow?" Dad says. 2 words that told me everything. She was not coming as my sister. She was coming as his. I did not wait for Nadine to arrive. The morning after her text, I drove to the first bank on my list and tried to close the gap myself. I already knew who had sent her. I was not ready to sit across from my sister and pretend I did not. The loan officer at First Western did not even open the folder. He looked at the company's age, looked at the debt structure, and slid my application back across the desk before I finished my first sentence. "Ma'am," he said, leaning back in a vinyl chair that stuck to his forearms, the same way mine stuck to mine. "You're asking us to lend against a company where someone else holds a convertible note with an active acceleration clause. That's not a loan, that's a donation." 3 more banks over the next 3 days gave me the same answer, faster each time. A branch manager at Arvest, who looked like she genuinely wished she could help, told me the gentlest version of it. The note made the company unlendable. You cannot borrow against something someone else already has the contractual right to take. 4 banks. 3 days. The shortest meeting lasted 6 minutes. Nobody said sorry. On day 9, I sat in my car in the Arvest parking lot and watched a woman walk a golden retriever past my bumper. She was wearing sandals and drinking iced coffee, and she had no idea that the woman in the parked sedan next to her was losing everything in slow motion. I sat there until the parking lot emptied and the branch lights turned off, and then I drove home and did not sleep. Day 10. My father convened a shareholder meeting at the Garrison Avenue dining table, the same table where he had slid the contract 3 years earlier. The same chairs, the same old wood smell, and the same coffee my mother had brewed in the same pot. She set out 4 cups. She knew there would be 4 people. She had known before I did. 20 minutes. That is how long it takes to steal a company from your own daughter when you have had 18 months to set the table. My father sat at the head. He wore a sport coat, which he never wore at home, a detail that told me this was not a family meeting, it was a performance. Nadine sat to his left. She did not look at me when I walked in. My mother stood in the doorway to the kitchen, holding a dish towel, occupying the same position she had occupied the night he first presented the note. Vernon did not make small talk. He opened a manila folder and read from a printed agenda. "Motion to convert the outstanding note per Section 6C, he said. "Motion to remove the current president. Motion to appoint Nadine Aldrich Pruitt as interim president of the company. All in favor." He raised his hand, and Nadine raised hers. Without looking up, without hesitating, without the smallest flicker of conflict crossing her face. She had known. She had known before she sent that text. She had known before the certified letter arrived. She had been briefed, prepared, and positioned, and the sister who had eaten tacos on my loading dock and told me she did not know I had it in me had voted to take it away from me with her eyes on the table. "You planned this," I said. My voice was level. My hands were not. I pressed them flat against the edge of the dining table and felt the wood grain under my fingertips. Every step, the addendum, the timing, the banks. "I exercised a contract," my father said. "That's all this is." He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at me the way he looked at a vendor invoice that had come in over budget, mild annoyance, nothing more. And he said the sentence that I have carried in my chest for 10 years, like a piece of shrapnel too deep to remove. "It was never really yours. You just didn't read the fine print." Then he walked out of the dining room. Nadine was already rearranging papers in the seat I had just occupied. She was sitting in my chair. She was holding my company, and she still had not looked at me. My mother folded the meeting minutes into thirds. She did not read them. She did not unfold them. She carried them into the kitchen the way she carried everything, quietly, efficiently, without acknowledgement that what she was holding had weight. I heard the faucet turn on. I heard her washing a single coffee cup. The meeting had lasted 20 minutes, and my mother was already cleaning up after it, as though the last third of an hour had been a weather report. I stood up from my father's dining table with nothing. No company, no title, no vote, no family, if I am being honest, because a family that does this is not a family. It is a board of directors with shared genetics. I walked out the front door. I did not say goodbye. Nobody called after me. The screen door closed behind me with the same soft click it had made every summer of my childhood, and I drove to my lab in the dark. The locks on the lab had already been changed. I drove there in the dark after the meeting and found a new deadbolt on the front door and a cardboard box sitting on the sidewalk beside the entrance. My coffee mug, a framed photo of my first client handshake, and my lab notebook. 3 years of work reduced to a box you could carry with one hand. 3 weeks later, in May, my phone lit up with a voicemail from a client I had not spoken to in months. Her name was Dr. Beth Willard, a veterinarian with a small practice in Springdale. Her voice crackled through the speaker with the confused tone of someone reading something that does not make sense. "Hey, I got your letter about the transition, but something looks off. Since when do you call yourself a subsidiary of Aldrich Scientific? Did you actually write this?" I called her back. She emailed me a scanned copy of the letter. I opened it on my laptop and felt the floor shift under my feet. The letter was addressed to her on professional letterhead. Not my letterhead, but a new company called Pruitt Lab Services. It informed her that all compliance services previously handled by my consultancy were being transitioned to Pruitt Lab Services under the management of Nadine Aldrich Pruitt, and it bore my signature at the bottom. My full name, my handwriting, the same loop on the A, the same pressure on the downstroke, the same slight rightward lean I have had since I was 12. I pulled up the insurance addendum I had signed at my lab bench in March. I held the two signatures side by side on my screen. They were identical, not similar, identical. Same angle, same pixel weight, same pen hesitation on the crossbar of the T. It was not my signature. It was a photograph of my signature, scanned from that one real page and pasted onto a letter I had never seen. Remember that insurance form? One page, one checkbox, one real signature at the bottom that I gave him voluntarily because the document was exactly what it appeared to be. This is what it was for. I called 6 more former clients that afternoon. All of them had received the same letter. In total, every client I had built over 3 years, every name I had ever written on that whiteboard, had gotten a professional-looking transition notice bearing my forged signature, telling them I had voluntarily transferred my services to my sister's company. Every one of them thought I had walked away. Every one of them believed I had chosen to leave. 40 letters, 40 clients, 40 lies with my name at the bottom. And the originals, the letters with actual ink, the ones that could prove in court that the signatures were scanned forgeries, were sitting inside the company my father now controlled. I drove to Sabine's office that afternoon with the scanned copies printed out and fanned across her desk like a losing hand. She looked at them one by one. She held each page by the corners. She compared the signatures the way I had, side by side, pixel by pixel, and then she set them down and looked at me with the expression of a woman who has spent a decade in courtrooms and knows exactly where the walls are. Imagine knowing exactly who robbed you. Imagine holding the photograph of them doing it, and then imagine being told the photograph is not admissible because the thief owns the camera. "Scans prove nothing in court," Sabine said. "I need originals, paper with ink on it, and every one of those originals is sitting inside a company your father controls." She laid out the rest of it with the precision of someone delivering a diagnosis. Filing in Sebastian County meant Vernon's hometown, Vernon's judges, Vernon's decades of charitable donations to every civic institution with a gavel. Case would die in discovery. And the statute of limitations on fraud was already running. Every month I waited, the window to file shrank. "The proof exists," she said, "but it's locked inside a building you can't enter, in a jurisdiction where your father has been buying goodwill since before you were born." I drank cold water from a paper cone cup in her waiting room and stared at the wall and tried to think of a single move I could make. There was nothing. I had the truth. I had scanned evidence of a crime committed against me by my own family, and I had absolutely no legal mechanism to use any of it. So what do you do when the law cannot help you? The courts belong to him, and the clock is already running. Sabine closed the folder and said one more thing. She said it quietly, almost as an afterthought, the way people say things they want you to remember years from now. "You can't win this in Fort Smith. Maybe not in any courtroom. But if you ever get those originals, if someone inside that company ever hands you the paper with ink on it, call me, any hour." I drove home that evening knowing two things. I needed those original letters, and the only way to get them was to become powerful enough that the company came to me. Not through a lawsuit, not through a judge, through the kind of leverage that does not require permission. I did not know how long it would take. I did not know what it would cost. But I knew where I was going, and I knew I was going alone. I started building that power the only way I knew how, by leaving. In September 2014, 4 months after the shareholder meeting, I loaded my car in the dark. Not much to load. The whiteboard barely fit in the back seat. I had to fold down the passenger side to wedge it in. 4 feet of dry erase laminate that still had my first quarter revenue projections written in blue marker that would not fully erase no matter how many times I wiped. Ghost numbers. Proof of something that used to be real. I did not take photos. I did not take the quilt from the guest room or the coffee mug my mother had given me when I turned 21. I took the whiteboard, the cardboard box from the lab sidewalk, a manila folder full of scanned forgeries, and my laptop. That was the entire inventory of my life at 26. I drove to a drive-through ATM on Rogers Avenue and withdrew my last $4,800. The machine counted out 20s with a mechanical rhythm that sounded like a metronome set to the tempo of starting over. I put the cash in a bank envelope and dropped it in the cup holder and pulled onto Route 71 heading south. I passed my father's warehouse on the way out of town. The sign still said, Aldrich Scientific Supply. My name had been off the lab door for months, but it was still on that building, the family name, mounted in block letters that caught the streetlight. I did not slow down. I did not look twice. I kept my eyes on the highway and my hands at 10 and 2, and I drove. I want you to sit with that number for a second, $4,800, because the next time you hear a dollar amount in this story, it is going to have a lot more zeros. Nobody called. Not that day, not the next. Not my father, not my mother, not my sister. I drove 11 hours through Texarkana and Longview and Palestine, and past the point where the pine forests thin out into central Texas scrub, and my phone did not ring once. I drank gas station coffee that went cold somewhere south of Lufkin, and I did not turn on the radio because silence was the only company I could tolerate, and silence was the loudest thing my family had ever said to me. The Austin skyline appeared through my dusty windshield at dusk, a scattering of lights against a bruised sky. It did not look like a promised land. It looked like a city that did not know my name, which at that moment was exactly what I needed. I rented a studio apartment for $400 a month. No dishwasher, roaches in the baseboards. The carpet smelled like the previous tenant's failures and a landlord's indifference. I carried the whiteboard up 2 flights of stairs and hung it on the wall above the kitchen table, which was also my desk, which was also my dining room. The next morning, I started cold calling small labs, veterinary clinics, independent pathology offices, dental practices with aging equipment and expiring certifications. I offered contract compliance consulting at $40 an hour. The going rate was $150. I did not care. I needed the first yes more than I needed the money. $40 an hour. I want you to hold that number next to the one from the opening of this story. The woman who would build a company valued at more than $1 billion was charging less than a plumber in a studio apartment that smelled like roach spray and old carpet. The first client said yes on day 3. A small veterinary research lab on the east side that needed their FDA paperwork updated before an inspection. I drove there in the car that still had whiteboard marks on the back seat, and I did the work in 2 days, and I invoiced them $80. And when the payment cleared, I sat in my studio and felt something I had not felt since the dining room meeting. The specific private electricity of earning something no one could take from me. I wrote my new client's name on the whiteboard in the same blue marker I had used in Fort Smith. One name, one client, the same ritual, different city, same proof, and beneath it, in block letters, I wrote 5 words that would stay on that whiteboard for the next 10 years. Build it again, build it bigger. That whiteboard was the only thing from Fort Smith that made the trip. Not photos, not keepsakes, not a single object connected to the family that had taken everything else. Just the whiteboard with its ghost numbers and its blue marker. And now 5 words that functioned less as a motivational slogan and more as an engineering specification. I stood in that studio smelling roach spray and old carpet, staring at those 5 words, and I did not know yet that the first phone call, the one that would change the trajectory of everything I was building, was 6 days away. I did not know the name. I did not know the voice. I only knew that I was 26 years old with $4,800 and a whiteboard and a plan that had no timeline and no guarantee and no safety net. But I also knew something my father did not. I knew how to start from nothing. I had done it before. And this time, nobody was going to hand me a contract and call it a gift. 6 days after I arrived in Austin, my phone rang with a 512 area code I did not recognize. The voice on the other end was fast, confident, and slightly amused, like a man who had already decided the conversation was going to go well before he dialed. I hear you're the person who actually reads the 21 CFR Part 58 footnotes, he said. I've never met anyone who does that voluntarily. His name was Griffin Everett. He was 31 years old, an operations specialist who had left a mid-size pharma company in Houston because he was tired of optimizing systems he did not believe in. A shared client, my second, a small research lab on the east side, had mentioned my name, and Griffin had done what Griffin always did. He called before he overthought it. I don't need a partner, I told him. I need 11 more clients. What if I told you I could get you both? I almost hung up. I had spent the past year learning what happens when you trust someone who sounds like they are offering you exactly what you need. But Griffin was not offering me a gift. He was offering me a transaction, his business development skills for a share of something we would build together. He did not frame it as generosity. He did not frame it as rescue. He framed it as a market opportunity, and the market opportunity was my obsessive precision. That was the difference. My father had looked at my company and seen something to own. Griffin looked at my methods and saw something to sell. This is the part of the story most people skip. The 2 years of grinding that nobody films, nobody celebrates, and nobody believes in except the person doing it. There is no montage for cold calling veterinary clinics at 7 in the morning. There is no soundtrack for splitting a co-working desk down the middle with a strip of blue tape because you cannot afford to. There is no dramatic arc in driving 40 minutes each way to inspect an autoclave calibration log for a client who pays you less per hour than a plumber. But that is what we did. Within a month, Griffin and I were sharing that co-working desk. Within 6 months, we had 11 steady contracts. He handled invoicing, client acquisition, and the business development calls I hated making. I handled the science, the audits, the protocol design, the compliance reviews that required the kind of meticulous attention most people find pathological. By the end of 2015, we had outgrown the co-working space and were looking at lab rentals. In early 2016, we incorporated, 3 employees, 1 rented lab in a light industrial park off Burnett Road, and the same whiteboard from Fort Smith, now hanging on a proper wall instead of over a kitchen table, with revenue projections that were actually coming true. 3 employees, 1 lab, the same whiteboard. I stood in front of it the day we signed the incorporation papers, and I felt something I had not felt since the loading dock in Fort Smith, the specific private electricity of building something real. Griffin noticed my habits early. He noticed that I read every contract twice before signing. He noticed that I triple-checked supply receipts for paper towels. He noticed that every protocol in our system was numbered, every deviation logged, every signature verified against a master file I maintained personally. "You triple-check a supply receipt for paper towels," he said one afternoon, leaning against the lab doorframe with a coffee mug and an expression that was half admiration and half concern. "I triple-check everything," I told him. "You'll thank me later." He did not ask why. Not then, not ever. Griffin was the rare kind of person who understood that some habits come from places you do not discuss, and that the right response is not curiosity, but respect. He never knew about the forged signature. He never knew about the dining table meeting, or the 40 letters, or the acceleration clause. He only knew that I ran the tightest documentation system he had ever seen, and that clients trusted us because of it. My father taught me one thing, and it was the only lesson of his I ever kept. A signature is a weapon. I would never hand someone that weapon again. Every document in our company was logged, tracked, and stored with the kind of chain of custody discipline that federal labs use for controlled substances. Every protocol had a version number. Every deviation had a timestamp and a corrective action. Every piece of paper that left our office had been read, reviewed, and verified by me personally before it carried my name. You know what the FDA loves more than anything? Paper trails. And nobody on earth kept better paper trails than a woman whose father had forged her signature and gotten away with it. By the end of 2016, we had 12 clients, 3 employees, and a reputation for documentation so clean that auditors complimented us. The paranoia I had developed in the aftermath of Fort Smith, the compulsive verification, the obsessive record-keeping, the refusal to sign anything without reading every line, had become our competitive advantage. My worst wound had become my best product. I had rebuilt everything my father destroyed: the clients, the lab, the revenue, the reputation, everything except the one thing I could not build alone: the evidence locked inside a company 400 miles north. For that, I needed someone who understood federal records the way I understood protocols. And that person had just retired from the FDA with 40 years of filing cabinets still organized in his head. I will tell you about Howard Prescott when the time is right. For now, what matters is this. While I was building, I was also learning to say no. The first venture partner who tried to invest in my company slid a term sheet across a glass conference table with a $15 million number on the cover page and a liquidation preference buried on page 4 that would have made my father proud. I read paragraph 6 first. I will always read paragraph 6 first. And then I slid the term sheet back across the table with 2 fingers. Griffin stared at me in the parking lot afterward. "That was $15 million you just pushed back across the table," he said. "It was a leash with a bigger number on it." Between 2016 and 2020, 2 more investors walked into our conference room with term sheets designed to exchange capital for control. Different fonts, same architecture. Liquidation preferences that surrendered decision-making authority. Board seats for people with no operational skin. Conversion clauses that would let them dilute my ownership if I sneezed at the wrong time. Every investor who walked through that door saw a growing company. I saw the same contract my father had slid across a dining table, repackaged in venture capital language. I said no 3 times. Then I said yes, once for the Series A, once for the Series C, but only on my terms. No liquidation preferences that surrendered control. No board seats without operational commitment. No clause on any page in any paragraph that gave someone else the power to take what I had built. By 2020, we had 53 employees, government contracts, trade press profiles, a real headquarters that smelled like new carpet and fresh coffee instead of roach spray and old carpet, and I still owned 71%. My father would have called that inefficient. I called it mine. This is the part of the story where most people expect me to smile. The family that destroyed me was, by all accounts, finally falling apart. But that is not what happened inside my chest when I got the phone call. It came in the spring of 2021. The caller was Constance Aldrich, my father's older sister, 71 years old, retired after 3 decades as the Sebastian County Library Director, and the only member of my family who still called without wanting something. Aunt Constance had a voice like someone reading aloud in a room where the walls were too thin. Low, careful, conspiratorial. "Your father won't say it out loud," she said, "but the warehouse on 71 is half empty. The industry shifted, and he didn't shift with it. And Nadine," she paused. "Honey, she's borrowing to make payroll. 34 people counting on a company that's running on fumes." I held the phone in my office and looked out the window at the Austin skyline and tried to feel the satisfaction I had imagined feeling for 7 years. It did not come. "And Mom?" I asked. "Lorraine sets the table every Sunday like nothing's changed. You know how she is?" I did know. My mother had spent her entire adult life setting tables and wiping them clean, and the distance between those two acts was exactly the width of her conscience. Constance did not ask me for anything. She never did. She simply delivered information the way a librarian delivers a book. "Here it is. Do with it what you will." I thanked her and hung up and sat in my office for a long time. 34 employees. I thought about that number all night. Those were not Nadine's people. They were working in a company built on my stolen clients, running protocols I had written, following compliance procedures I had designed from scratch in a rented lab that smelled like bleach. They did not know any of that. They showed up every morning and did good work and collected paychecks that were, according to my aunt, about to bounce. I was supposed to feel vindicated. The company my father had stolen and handed to my sister was dying. The empire was crumbling. The man who had called the convertible note a leash was watching his rope fray. This was the moment I had spent 7 years imagining, the slow, inevitable collapse of everything Vernon Aldrich had taken from me. But 34 people were going to lose their jobs. 34 people who had never forged a signature, never voted at a dining table shareholder meeting, never folded minutes into thirds without reading them. They were collateral damage in a family war they did not know existed, and they were about to pay for it with their livelihoods. I walked to the whiteboard, the same whiteboard. Fort Smith to Austin, studio apartment to headquarters, ghost numbers and blue marker and 5 words I had written 8 years ago that were still faintly visible beneath the revenue projections. I picked up a marker and wrote a number in the bottom corner. 34. Not because I wanted my sister's company back. I did not want it. I had built something better, something cleaner, something that belonged to me in every sense that mattered. I wrote that number because those 34 people were about to become casualties of my father's greed and my sister's inability to run what she had been handed. And I was the only person on earth with enough money and enough motive to do something about it. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in 7 years. Sabine answered on the second ring. I said 4 words. "I want to buy it." She did not ask what. She did not ask why. Sabine Gallagher had been waiting 7 years for this call, and when it came, she treated it the way she treated every piece of consequential information, with silence first, then precision. "Tell me what changed," she said. What changed was an email that arrived at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning in early 2022, forwarded from Sabine's network of distressed asset contacts. No subject line, One attachment. A regional bank's watch list, with my sister's company circled in red ink. Pruitt Lab Services. The company built on my stolen clients, running my stolen protocols, was 90 days from potential liquidation. Sabine walked me through it over speakerphone while I sat in my Austin office drinking espresso that went cold before I finished the first cup. The bank had flagged the company for chronic undercapitalization. If no buyer surfaced within the watch list window, the assets would be liquidated, equipment auctioned, contracts dissolved, records shredded or sold in bulk. Records. That was the word that stopped my breathing. The archived files, I said. The original client records, the transition letters from 2014, everything from that year. What happens to those in a liquidation? Shredded, auctioned, or dumped, Sabine said. Gone. You know what is worse than having your company stolen? Watching the proof get destroyed because nobody bought the wreckage in time. 8 years I had waited for those originals. 8 years of knowing they were sitting in a filing cabinet inside a building I could not enter, in a company I no longer owned. And now the clock was not just ticking on the statute of limitations, it was ticking on the evidence itself. If Nadine's company went into liquidation, the original forged letters would be shredded along with the payroll records and the vendor files and every other piece of paper that nobody thought mattered. The proof of what my father had done would cease to exist. I could not let that happen. I want to acquire it, I told Sabine. But if my father finds out I'm the buyer, he will burn that company to the ground before he lets me have it. He would rather destroy it than let me take it back. Sabine was quiet for a moment. I heard her pen tap the desk twice, the same habit she had had since the first time I sat in her office as a 23-year-old with a contract and a question. Then she spoke with the measured cadence of a woman who had spent a decade building structures designed to be invisible. Then we build a vehicle they can't see through. Private investment entity, nominee directors, Delaware registration, no public filings that trace back to you. 3 layers between your name and the transaction. How long? Patient money, patient paperwork. 2 years, maybe more. The bank won't rush. They want a clean buyer with stable capital, and we need to approach them at the right moment, after the desperation sets in, but before they start liquidating assets. She paused. Can you do patient? I've been patient for 8 years. We named it Quarry Creek Holdings. I chose the name myself. There is a limestone quarry behind the Aldrich family home on Garrison Avenue, a shallow cut in the hillside where the stone was pulled out decades ago, and the rain filled it into a pool the color of old concrete. When I was a child, I used to hide there when my parents fought. I would sit on the ledge with my feet in the cold water and wait for the shouting to stop. Nobody ever came looking for me. Nobody ever asked where I went. I named the shell company after the place where I learned to be invisible. Even the name was a secret, only I would understand. Sabine, Incorporated Quarry Creek Holdings on a Wednesday afternoon. Nominee directors in Delaware. A registered agent in Wilmington who had never heard my name and never would. My identity buried 3 layers deep behind corporate filings that read like a private equity fund with no particular history and no personal stakes. The incorporation papers came off the printer warm, and I held them in my hands and read every line twice, because I will always read every line twice. And then I signed them with a signature that belonged to me and no one else. The acquisition would take 2 years of patient negotiation. 2 years of conference calls where Sabine said, "my client," while I sat 3 feet away on mute. 2 years of financial modeling and bank outreach, and the slow, deliberate courtship of a regional lender who wanted nothing more than to offload a failing company from their balance sheet. 2 years during which not a single person in Fort Smith, not Vernon, not Lorraine, not Nadine, would have any idea that the anonymous buyer circling their family's collapsing empire was the daughter they had voted out at their own dining table. 8 years of patience, 2 more to go. And not a single Aldrich in Fort Smith had any idea what was coming. Sabine filed the last of the incorporation documents and looked at me over her glasses. "Now we wait," she said. "And while we wait, You need to find someone who can tell you exactly which filing cabinet those originals are sitting in. I already had a name. A retired federal compliance clerk with 40 years of filing cabinets organized in his head. I had met him at a biotech mixer the year before and filed his name away the same way he filed everything, carefully, precisely, and with the certainty that I would need it later. Howard Prescott answered on the second ring. I had rehearsed an explanation, who I was, why I was calling, what I needed, but I barely finished saying my father's name before he cut me off. I kept a copy of the directive email,
he said, his voice unhurried, the cadence of a man who had filed federal documents for 4 decades and never once lost track of a page. The one where Vernon's office instructed staff to scan your signature
onto the client transition letters. It's been in a fireproof box in my garage since 2015. I sat down on my kitchen floor. Not because I was surprised. Sabine had warned me that longtime employees sometimes kept insurance, but because Howard Prescott, 72, a retired FDA compliance records clerk who had spent 40 years cataloging lab submissions, had been waiting for someone to ask. 8 years. He had carried that box through a move from Fort Smith to a retirement bungalow in Bentonville, and not once had he thrown it away. The next 18 months became the quietest war I have ever fought. Sabine ran every negotiation through Quarry Creek Holdings, the Delaware shell we had built precisely for this purpose. Conference calls with the regional bank happened twice a month. I dialed in, muted myself, and listened while Sabine said "my client" over and over as if I were some faceless investment fund. I sat 3 feet from the speakerphone each time, drinking espresso that went cold by the second hour, saying nothing. The bank wanted $2.4 million. Distressed asset pricing. They did not care who was buying as long as the wire cleared. A fireproof box. 8 years. Howard had been waiting for this phone call longer than I had been planning to make it. I flew to Bentonville on a Tuesday in March 2023. Howard's living room smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco. He swore he had quit. He opened the fireproof box on his dining table. A single printed email, dated November 2014, from Vernon's office manager to the records department. The subject line read, "Signature templates, transition letters." 4 words that proved my father had ordered 40 forged documents. Howard smoothed the page flat with both palms, the way you handle something sacred. "Federal retention rules," he said. "Section 211-180. Lab records must be kept for the life of the product plus 2 years. Those originals are in a filing cabinet on the 2nd floor, 3rd row back. I filed half of them myself." He recited it from memory, no hesitation, the way a librarian recalls a call number. The originals still existed inside the company I was about to buy, sitting in a cabinet that no one had touched because no one understood retention schedules the way Howard did. Sabine built the acquisition timeline around that filing cabinet. Every clause, every closing condition, every escrow structure pointed toward one outcome. The moment the sale closed, I would have legal access to the 2nd floor. Howard's email was the map. The originals were the destination. Before I tell you what I found in those due diligence files, the detail that made me set the binder down and leave the room, drop your guess in 1 sentence. What do you think hurt more, losing the company or what came next? A quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. What matters is the lesson behind it. The due diligence binder arrived in late October 2023. Sabine had it couriered to my apartment in Austin. 3 inches thick, tabbed and indexed. Every operating procedure Pruitt Lab Services had filed with its accreditation body. I opened it at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee I never finished. Page 4, Section 3, the calibration checklist. I had written that checklist at 2 a.m. in a rented lab with a space heater under the desk because the landlord refused to fix the furnace. I recognized my formatting before I recognized Nadine's name typed across the header. My numbering system, my abbreviations, my shortcut for logging instrument drift. a method I had invented because no textbook covered it and no one at the FDA had thought to standardize it. Nadine's name sat at the top of every page like she had built the thing from scratch. I turned to the next section. My language. The next. My process. Every protocol I had developed between 2011 and 2014, copied wholesale, reformatted just enough to change the font, and filed under my sister's credentials. Her own handwriting beneath mine. Her own name over my numbering. 10 years, and every protocol still worked perfectly. They had not just taken my company. They had taken my thinking. Every workaround I had earned through late nights and failed experiments and FDA rejections that taught me what the textbooks left out. And the cruelest part was that the protocols were good. They had kept 34 employees paid for a decade. My methods, running under someone else's name, had done exactly what I had designed them to do. The work had survived, only the credit had been stolen. I closed the binder. I set it on my desk beside Howard's fireproof box email and Sabine's acquisition timeline, 3 stacks of paper that together formed a machine no one in Fort Smith could see coming. The acquisition would close in January, and then I was going to that family dinner. The wire cleared at 9:07 a.m. on a Tuesday in January 2024. I watched the confirmation populate on my screen. Quarry Creek Holdings to a regional bank in Fort Smith, the full acquisition amount. And for a long moment, I did not move. No one in Arkansas knew. Not my father, not my mother, not Nadine. A private equity firm out of Delaware had just rescued a failing lab services company, and the 34 employees who depended on that payroll had no idea that the rescuer was the woman whose name had been stripped from the original incorporation papers a decade earlier. Sabine called 11 minutes later. "Wire confirmed," she said. 70% is yours. Nadine signed the transfer this morning. She thinks she just got a lifeline from a fund manager she'll never meet. I could hear Sabine shifting papers. The mechanical efficiency of a woman who had spent 2.5 years building this moment, one clause at a time. The bridge loan, $600,000, clears tomorrow. I routed it through the payroll stabilization account like you asked. Every one of those 34 people gets paid before anything else moves, I said. Understood. A pause. You just spent $3 million to buy a company the bank valued at roughly half that. You know that, right? I didn't buy a company, I told her. I bought a filing cabinet. $3 million for a business worth 1.5. The most expensive filing cabinet in Arkansas history. Sabine had structured the deal so that Nadine retained a 30% stake and her management title. From Nadine's perspective, nothing had changed except the identity of the majority owner. And that identity was buried behind nominee directors, a Delaware registration, and Sabine's voice on every conference call. Nadine would continue running daily operations. She would continue signing her name on the protocols she had copied from me. She would continue believing that some anonymous fund had swooped in to save her from the bank's foreclosure timeline. The truth, that her younger sister now controlled the board, the budget, and every filing cabinet on the second floor, existed in exactly 3 places. My apartment in Austin, Sabine's office safe, and Howard Prescott's notarized testimony, which we had recorded in Bentonville the previous spring. I pulled up the payroll distribution schedule on my laptop. 34 names: lab technicians, quality assurance analysts, calibration specialists, an office manager, 2 shipping clerks. People who had built careers inside a company that had been hemorrhaging cash for 3 years because Nadine could copy my protocols but could not replicate the business instincts that had made them profitable. The bridge loan would cover 6 months of payroll while Sabine and I restructured the revenue model from behind the Delaware curtain. None of those 34 people would ever know how close they had come. Remember the 2 suitcases from the beginning of this story? Now you understand what I was packing. The direct deposits hit on Friday. I know because I checked. I opened the payroll software at 6:14 a.m. Austin time and watched each confirmation resolve. 34 green check marks appearing one after another like a roll call. 34 people drove to work that morning, performed their shifts, drove home, and told their families that everything was fine. Everything was fine. It had almost not been. I stood up from my desk and walked to the whiteboard mounted on the wall behind my kitchen table. The number had been there for 3 years, written in blue dry erase marker, the night Sabine first told me the company was drowning, 34. I had stared at it during every conference call, every muted negotiation, every sleepless night when the acquisition felt impossible. I picked up the eraser and pressed it flat against the surface. The marker came off in a single slow stroke, but it left a ghost, a pale blue shadow of the digits, a scar that would not fully clean no matter how many times I wiped. I set the eraser down and looked at that ghost for a long time. Now I owned the company. I owned the records. I owned the filing cabinet on the second floor, third row back, where Howard said the originals still sat in their labeled folders. I owned the compliance protocols that bore my sister's name and my handwriting. I owned the payroll that kept 34 families solvent. And I owned the evidence, Howard's email, the forged transition letters, and a notarized statement from a man who had waited 8 years for someone to ask the right question. 10 years. $3 million. A shell company named after the quarry road, where I used to park and cry in my car during college. What do you think happened when I finally walked through that front door on Garrison Avenue? I picked up my phone from the desk and set it back down without calling anyone. No family to tell. Not yet. There would be no invitation waiting for me. I would have to earn my way back to that table on my own timeline, not theirs. I looked at the blue ghost on the whiteboard and got back to work. The pallet arrived on a Saturday morning in February. 41. Banker's boxes shrink-wrapped to a wooden skid, and I was waiting at the loading dock of my Austin office with latex gloves and a chain of custody log I had printed at 5 a.m. The moving company driver looked at the gloves and the clipboard and asked if I was expecting hazardous materials. I told him no, just paper. I had arranged the transfer through Sabine 3 weeks after the acquisition closed. As the new majority owner, I had legal authority over every archived document in the company's possession. Sabine filed the retrieval request through Quarry Creek's nominee directors, so Nadine would see only a routine records audit, standard procedure for any new ownership group. The boxes arrived sealed with the original packing tape, labels typed by someone in Fort Smith who had no idea the woman receiving them had written half the documents inside. Chain of custody. Photograph the box before opening. Log the label, the date, the position on the skid. The label, the date, the position on the skid. Snap gloves on. Cut the tape. I was not opening my father's records. I was processing a crime scene. If this ever reached a courtroom, every folder needed to trace back to this loading dock with no gaps, no questions, no moment where a defense attorney could claim contamination. I had spent 2 evenings reading federal evidence handling protocols, and I followed them the way Howard Prescott followed retention schedules. By the letter, no shortcuts. 41 boxes. A decade of someone else running the company I had built. It was like reading the autopsy of your own life performed by the people who ended it. Box 1, 2019. Vendor invoices. Box 2, 2020. Client contracts. I worked backward through the years, photographing each folder before I touched it, logging the contents in a spreadsheet with timestamps. The office was silent. No staff on Saturdays, no phones ringing, just the sound of packing tape tearing and the camera shutter on my phone clicking over and over. Cardboard dust rose from the older boxes and hung in the loading dock light like suspended ash. By noon, I had processed 16 boxes and found nothing older than 2017. I ate a granola bar standing up. I did not sit down. Box 17, Box 18, Box 19, 2016, Box 20, 2015. The labels were typed in the same font, the same format, year after year, as if the company had been frozen in administrative amber. I kept cutting and photographing. The latex gloves made my hands sweat. The cardboard smelled like the back room of my father's supply warehouse, that particular scent of old paper and neglect that I had grown up breathing every summer. I found the 2014 label at 2:17 p.m. I know because I photographed the timestamp before I cut the tape. But 26. The label read, Client Transitions, 2014, in the same typed font as all the others. I set my phone on the edge of the box, pressed record for a video log, and sliced the tape with a box cutter. Inside, 40 manila folders, each containing a client transition letter. The letters I already knew about, the ones bearing my forged signature, the ones Howard had described from memory. I lifted the first folder and opened it. My name at the bottom of the page. A signature I had not written. The same letter Sabine had shown me in her office years ago, but this was the original, ink on paper, not a scan. I was reaching for the second folder when I saw it. A yellowed sticky note, pressed between the 5th and 6th folders, half hidden by a paperclip. Blocky capital letters in blue ink, handwriting I would recognize in any context, on any surface, because I had seen it on birthday cards and warehouse invoices and grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator on Garrison Avenue my entire childhood. 6 words. Use the March signature page. His initials in the bottom corner, VA, written the same way he initialed purchase orders at Aldrich Scientific Supply. The same careless flick of the pen. 6 words on a yellowed sticky note. That was all it took to prove that my father had personally directed the forgery of my signature on 40 client letters. I had never destroyed it. That fact settled over me slowly, heavier than anything in those 41 boxes. He had not shredded it, had not peeled it off and thrown it away, had not even moved it to a less obvious location. It had sat between folders 5 and 6 for a decade, because he never believed I would become powerful enough to own the filing cabinet it was sitting in. I was not worth the effort of a cover-up. I held the note 6 inches from my face. My hands were shaking inside the latex gloves. I photographed it, front, back, in context between the folders, with a ruler for scale. Then I set it down on the concrete floor and sat beside it, my back against box 26, and I cried. Not from sadness, not from anger, from relief. The sound a lock makes when it finally opens after you have been turning the key for 10 years. Salt hit the corner of my mouth, and I let it stay. I placed the sticky note into a clear evidence sleeve, sealed it, wrote the date and time on the label in my own handwriting, and called Sabine. I found his handwriting, I said. VA. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, Pack the suitcases. I packed the first suitcase on a Sunday morning. The original forged letters, Vernon's sticky note in its evidence sleeve, and Howard's notarized testimony. But I was not finished with the boxes. I had processed 26 of 41. The remaining 15 sat in my office like unexploded ordnance, and something in the way the folders had been arranged, too neat, too deliberate, told me there was more to find. I cleared my conference table, locked the office door, and laid out all 40 letters side by side, 8 rows of 5 on the glass surface, each one bearing the same signature at the bottom. My name, written by no one I knew. I leaned over the first row with a magnifying loupe I had bought from a forensics supply catalog. Same pen angle on every letter. Same pressure fade where the ballpoint lifted at the end of the H. Same loop on the capital A. Not similar. Identical. Pixel. Identical. A single signature scanned from one source document and pasted 40 times, printed on 40 different letters, mailed to 40 different clients who believed I had personally decided to abandon them. I photographed each letter with a ruler for scale, logging the measurements in my spreadsheet. Between letters 18 and 19, I found a folded printout I had missed during the initial pass. An internal email from someone with the initials MR in Vernon's office. The body was 2 sentences. Handle the transition letters per V's instructions. She'll understand someday. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. She'll understand someday. That is what it sounds like when someone steals from their own child and sleeps soundly. My father had not merely committed forgery. He had narrated it to himself as an act of paternal wisdom, a difficult lesson delivered by a man who knew better. He believed he was teaching me something. He believed that one day I would look back and be grateful. I set the email beside the sticky note. 2 documents, 2 handwritings, 1 delusion. Vernon had ordered the forgery with 6 words on a sticky note and then justified it with 7 more in an email he never expected anyone to read. The arrogance was architectural, load-bearing, holding up the entire structure of his self-image. He was not a thief. He was a father making hard choices. I turned back to the box. Beneath the 40 manila folders, at the very bottom, pressed flat by the weight of a decade of paper, I found a rubber-banded stack of cream-colored envelopes. 20 of them. I pulled the stack out, and the rubber band left a dent in the paper where it had been pressing for 10 years. I slid it off, and it snapped in my fingers, brittle from age. The envelopes were pre-addressed. Each one bore a client name and mailing address in handwriting I recognized before I understood what I was holding. Looping, cursive, meticulous spacing, the capital L, leaning slightly right the way it always had. On grocery lists, on Christmas cards, on the birthday envelopes that arrived at my apartment every October with a $20 bill inside, and Love Mom written above the seal. 20 spare envelopes, not 40. 20 extras. My mother had prepared backup envelopes in case of addressing errors or postage mistakes. She had planned for contingencies. This was not a woman who had been told to help and complied out of obedience. This was someone who had anticipated the workflow, calculated the margin for error, and produced surplus materials the way a bookkeeper prepares for an audit. Because that is what Lorraine was. The bookkeeper. The woman who balanced the ledger at Aldrich Scientific Supply, who kept receipts in labeled folders and reconciled bank statements every month without being asked. She brought the same precision to destroying my company that she brought to everything else. The same handwriting. Birthday cards and forgery envelopes, written by the same hand, with the same careful loops, the same even spacing that made every word look like it belonged in a penmanship textbook. My mouth went dry. I tried to swallow and could not. The conference table held a family portrait drawn entirely in evidence. My father's blocky capitals on the sticky note, my mother's perfect cursive on the envelopes, and 40 copies of my own signature that neither of them had the decency to forge by hand. They had scanned it. They could not even be bothered to practice. I set the rubber-banded envelopes beside Vernon's sticky note and the internal email. 3 artifacts from 3 members of my family, each one a confession written in their own hand. Somewhere in Fort Smith, right now, both of my parents were setting the table for a summer dinner they believed they controlled. My mother was probably polishing the good silverware, the set she kept in the sideboard on Garrison Avenue, wrapped in cloth she replaced every 5 years. My father was probably checking the grill. Neither of them knew that the guest of honor was coming with 2 suitcases. The first suitcase would hold everything on this table, the evidence, the proof, the 40 letters, and the sticky note, and the envelopes, and the email that said I would understand someday. The second suitcase would take longer to pack because it did not hold the past. It held what I was going to do next. I packed the evidence suitcase that evening. The 40 letters, the sticky note, the envelopes, the internal email. The second suitcase sat open on my bed, empty, waiting for documents I had not yet assembled. But before I could fill it, Howard Prescott walked into my office on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying a manila envelope worn soft at the edges from nearly a decade inside a fireproof box. He set it on my desk the way a man sets down something he has been tired of carrying. I forwarded the original to my personal email the night before they let me go, he said, lowering himself into the chair across from me. He smelled faintly of drugstore aftershave, the kind that comes in a glass bottle with a ship on the label. 40 years filing federal records. You develop a nose for when something's going to disappear. He opened the envelope and slid out 2 items. A printed copy of the 2014 directive email, the same one I had found on the sticky notes companion printout, and a notarized sworn statement, 6 pages, signed in his careful hand and stamped by a Benton County notary 3 weeks earlier. I read the statement while Howard sat quietly, his hands folded on his knee, waiting without impatience. He had written it in the plain language of a man who had spent 4 decades describing documents for federal auditors. No emotion, no editorializing, just dates and file numbers and the specific drawer where each original had been stored. At the bottom of the last page, above his signature, he had written a single personal sentence. I am 72 years old. I have no financial interest in this matter. I kept this record because the directive was wrong. A forwarded email, a notarized statement, and a man who filed things correctly for 40 years. That is the most unremarkable sentence in this story, and it is the one that made everything else possible. I looked up at Howard. Why didn't you report it at the time? He met my eyes without flinching. Report it to whom? Vernon owned the company. The office manager sent the directive. HR reported to the office manager. I was a records clerk. I didn't have standing to challenge anyone, so I did what I knew how to do. I kept a copy. He paused. I figured someone would come asking eventually. I just didn't think it would take 9 years. I thanked him. I shook his hand. He left my office and I sat with the chain of evidence now complete on my desk. The sticky note, the email, the sworn testimony, the 40 originals, and my mother's envelopes. 5 artifacts from 5 sources, each one corroborating the others, each one admissible. I locked them in my office safe and drove home. The phone rang at 8:47 that evening. I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee that had gone bitter 20 minutes ago. The screen showed a Fort Smith area code and a name I had not seen on my phone in over a year. Nadine. I know you bought it, she said. No greeting, no warmth, no preamble. Her voice was tight, the voice of someone who had been rehearsing a sentence all day and was afraid she would lose it if she paused. I don't know how, but I know. The new ownership group. The Delaware Fund. It's you. If you're going to do something, do it now. I've got 34 people who need to know if they still have jobs next month. 6 seconds. That is how long I let her words sit in the air before I answered. 6 seconds is an eternity when the truth is sitting in your throat and the person on the other end of the line has been carrying the same secret you have. One question first, I said. My voice was steady. I had been practicing this question longer than Nadine had been rehearsing her speech. The transition letters, the ones with my signature, did you see them before they were sent, or after? The line went silent. Not the silence of a dropped call. I could hear Nadine breathing, a shallow intake that caught at the top, like she had started to speak, and then stopped. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It wasn't like that, she started. That's not what I asked. More silence. I pressed the phone harder against my ear and listened to my sister breathe in a house in Fort Smith, where 34 people's paychecks depended on a woman who could not answer a yes or no question. I did not help her. I did not rephrase. I waited. She never answered. She said, "I'll see you at dinner," and hung up. Father, mother, sister. All 3 knew. All 3 participated. And not one of them, in 10 years, had ever picked up a phone to say they were sorry. I sat in the dark of my kitchen for a long time after that call. Then I walked to my bedroom, opened the second suitcase, and began packing the future. The Quarry Creek acquisition documents. The employee ownership trust that Sabine had drafted in January. The mechanism that would transfer controlling interest to the 34 people who had kept the company alive. And one last item, tucked into the suitcase's interior pocket. A prepaid college fund in the name of Wren Pruitt, age 9, my niece, who had done nothing wrong and deserved a way out that did not require waiting a decade to build one. The second suitcase was closed and latched by midnight. Both bags sat by my front door, one holding everything my family had done, the other holding everything I had decided to do instead. I should have gone to bed. I did not. At 1:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in April, I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed a title I would never send. Full disclosure, criminal referral package for Sebastian County DA. I wrote it all. The criminal referral first. Forgery of 40 client transition documents. Wire fraud related to the convertible note. Conspiracy to deprive a business owner of lawful property. Then the civil complaint. Breach of fiduciary duty. Fraud. Unjust enrichment. Conversion of intellectual property. Then the press release, drafted in the neutral language of a trade publication tip. Aldrich Scientific Supply owner implicated in decade-long forgery scheme targeting his own daughter. Then the IRS notification. Unreported income from the liquidation of assets acquired through forged instruments. 4 documents, 4 keystrokes to send. My entire family reduced to a cautionary tale on the evening news in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Every line was precise. Every allegation was supported by the evidence locked in my office safe. The sticky note, the email, Howard's testimony, the 40 originals, my mother's envelopes. I had built a machine that could end Vernon's business, strip Nadine of her professional credentials, and turn Lorraine from the woman who organized the church potluck into a co-conspirator named in a federal filing. I sat back and read the whole thing twice. I know what you are thinking. Send it. They earned it. But stay with me, because what I did next was harder than revenge, and it mattered more. The memo sat on my screen for 40 minutes. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the last page like a heartbeat. My office was dark except for the laptop glow, and the coffee on my desk had gone cold an hour ago. I could hear the building's ventilation system humming, the only sound in a room where I had just written the end of my family in 12-point type. I thought about Wren, 9 years old. She drew horses on her math homework. Nadine had mentioned it during one of our rare phone calls 2 years ago, before everything went silent. Wren called Vernon Papow. She sat on his lap at Thanksgiving and helped Lorraine roll pie crust in the kitchen on Garrison Avenue. If I sent the criminal referral, her grandfather faced prosecution. If I sent the civil suit, her mother lost her career and possibly the house. If I sent the press release, Wren would Google her own last name someday and find the wreckage before she was old enough to understand it. Wren did not get a vote in what her family had done to me. She did not get a vote in what I did back. What do you do when you have the match and the gasoline and every legal right to strike? And a 9-year-old girl who draws horses is standing in the blast radius? I stared at the screen. The cursor kept blinking. I could feel the keyboard keys still warm under my fingers from an hour of typing. The memo was airtight. Sabine would have filed it without changing a word. Every attorney I had ever consulted would have told me to send it, and it tasted like poison. Not justice, poison. The kind that dissolves the person holding the bottle as thoroughly as it dissolves the target. At 2:27 a.m., I highlighted the entire document. Every page, every line, every allegation I had earned the right to make, and I pressed delete. The screen went blank. The cursor blinked on an empty page. I sat in the dark and breathed. Then I opened a different folder, the one Sabine had prepared in January. The Employee Ownership Trust. The legal mechanism that would transfer controlling interest in the company to the 34 people who had shown up every day and done the work and never known who really owned the protocols they followed. I read through it once, confirmed every clause, and saved it to the second suitcase's document folder. Beside it, I placed the paperwork for a prepaid education account, funded, irrevocable, in the name of my niece. I deleted the memo. Not because I forgave them. I have not forgiven them. I deleted it because justice is not destruction. Justice is making sure the people who had no voice in the crime are protected from the aftermath. The 34 employees would own the company. Wren would have a college fund no one could touch, and every person sitting at that dinner table on Garrison Avenue would hear exactly what they did, from my mouth, with the evidence in front of them, in the house where they planned it. They would know. That was enough. That had to be enough. At 2:47 a.m. I closed my laptop. The office went dark. I stood there a moment longer, thinking about the dinner I had not yet been invited to and was going to attend anyway. When the invitation finally came, I would not bring dessert. I was going to bring 2 suitcases, one packed with proof of what they did, one packed with proof of who I chose to be. And whenever that dinner came, it would no longer be theirs to host. It would be mine. The 2 suitcases sat by my front door for 3 weeks before I moved them to the trunk of a rental car. But before I drove to Fort Smith, I had one more meeting with Sabine. She leaned back in her leather chair, tapped her pen twice on the edge of her desk, and asked the question that would define everything that came after. Do you want justice, or do you want a verdict? I did not answer immediately. The office smelled the same as it had 3 years ago, leather and espresso, and the faint chemical note of legal pads. But I was not the same woman who had first walked through that door, carrying a stack of forged letters and a convertible note I barely understood. Sabine waited. She was good at waiting. What's the difference? I asked. The statute of limitations on fraud expired 18 months ago, she said. Her voice was clinical, the voice of an attorney delivering facts she had already reconciled. Criminal referral to the Sebastian County DA is dead, and even if it weren't, you'd be filing against a man who has donated to the campaign fund of every sitting judge in the district. A verdict was never on the table for you. It was never going to be. I sat with that. 10 years of gathering evidence, and no courtroom would ever hear it. No judge would ever read the sticky note or the email or Howard's testimony. No jury would ever see my mother's handwriting on those envelopes. I know. After everything I found, there was no criminal case. The law had a clock, and my father had outlasted it. But listen to what Sabine said next, because it changed the entire equation. A verdict requires a judge, she said. Justice doesn't. You have every piece of evidence a prosecutor would need, and you don't need a prosecutor. You show them what you know. You protect the people who need protecting. You lay the truth on the table, literally on the table, and you let it do the damage. No gavel required. She set her pen down. A courtroom gives you a ruling. A dining room gives you their faces when they realize you know everything. No courtroom, no judge. Just a dining room table on Garrison Avenue and every piece of evidence arranged where my family would have to look at it while I watched. That was the plan. That had always been the plan, even before I knew it. Every step since the first phone call to Sabine had been building toward a room, not a courtroom. Sabine opened a folder on her desk. One more thing. I contacted Leland Hatch. The name landed in my chest like a stone. Leland Hatch, my father's attorney on Towson Avenue in Fort Smith, the man who had drafted the convertible note that started all of this. I sent him a formal inquiry about the terms of the original loan instrument, attorney to attorney, privileged correspondence. He responded in writing. She slid a single page across the desk. Heavy bond paper, embossed letterhead, the Towson Avenue address printed in small type at the bottom. I picked it up and read it. Vernon's own lawyer, the man he hired to draft the contract. Even he had tried to talk him out of it. Hatch's statement was 3 paragraphs. The relevant sentence was in the second, I advised Mr. Aldrich that the acceleration terms were unusually punitive for a family loan and recommended standard repayment provisions. He was adamant. His exact words were, "Draft it the way I told you." I read that sentence 4 times. Draft it the way I told you. My father had sat across from his own attorney in a law office on Towson Avenue and overruled a professional warning because the predatory terms were the point. The convertible note was never a lifeline. It was never a father helping his daughter. It was an instrument designed to transfer ownership the moment I stumbled, and Vernon had insisted on keeping the trigger hair fine even when his own lawyer told him it was excessive. Sabine watched me read. "His own counsel," she said quietly, "in writing, on letterhead." Vernon designed that note as a takeover instrument from the beginning, and now we have his attorney confirming it. I set the letter down on her desk. The paper was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its weight. I thought about the morning in 2014 when my father had handed me the note across this same kind of desk. Smiling, generous, the patriarch extending a hand to his ambitious daughter. And the whole time, the terms had been engineered to snap shut the moment I needed more runway. His lawyer had warned him. He had overruled the warning, and then he had handed me the document and watched me sign it. I did not need a courtroom. I had a dining room table, a stack of evidence that now included the testimony of his own attorney and a family that had no idea I had already won. I added Hatch's letter to the first suitcase that evening. Sticky note, forged letters, my mother's envelopes, Howard's testimony, and now Vernon's own lawyer confirming premeditation. I zipped it shut and set it beside the second suitcase. Everything was ready. The dinner was 3 weeks away, and for the first time in 10 years, I was looking forward to going home. Here is what most people get wrong about revenge stories. They end with destruction. Someone wins, someone loses, and the wreckage is supposed to feel like justice. This story ends with a trust fund and an employee ownership agreement, and I can tell you from experience that building those was harder than tearing anything down. 3 weeks before the dinner, Sabine and I sat in her office with the printer running and 2 legal pads between us. The first suitcase was already packed, every piece of evidence sealed, logged, and arranged in the order I planned to present it. The second suitcase was still empty, and filling it required a different kind of precision. Not forensic, architectural. Sabine pulled up the draft she had been refining since January, the Employee Ownership Trust. She walked me through it clause by clause, her pen clicking against the desk as she reviewed each section. 70% of Quarry Creek Holdings' stake in the company transfers into the trust, she said. Vested over 3 years, the 34 current employees become owners proportional to tenure. Nadine keeps her 30% equity but loses management control. The employee board elects its own leadership. She cannot sell her stake, cannot liquidate assets, cannot touch the trust's portion. I listened and followed along on my copy. The printer hummed in the corner, finishing the final signature pages. The document was 43 pages long. Sabine had spent 4 months drafting it, and every clause reflected the same principle. The people who had kept the company alive deserved to own it. This is the part that separated me from my father. He used paperwork to take. I was using paperwork to give. Those 34 people kept my protocols running for a decade, I said. They showed up every day and did the work and never knew whose methods they were following. They earned this. They just didn't know they were earning it. Sabine nodded. She had heard variations of this from me for 3 years, but she never rushed me through it. She understood that I needed to say it out loud each time, not for her benefit, but for mine. My father had used ownership as a weapon, a lever he could pull to transfer control the moment I faltered. I was turning that same mechanism into a shield for people who had no idea they needed one. Sabine set the trust documents aside and opened a second folder. This one is simpler, she said, and more personal. The College Fund, an independent education trust for Wren Pruitt, managed by a fiduciary trustee based in Austin, deliberately housed in a different state, beyond the reach of any family member in Fort Smith. I had funded it with enough to cover 4 years at a state university. The beneficiary was 9 years old. 9 years old. Draws horses on her math homework. Has no idea her aunt just built her a future that her own family cannot take away. Trustee in Austin. Independent management. No family signatories. Sabine confirmed, reviewing the final pages. Vernon cannot redirect it. Nadine cannot borrow against it. Doug cannot access it. Wren gets notification at 18 and full access upon enrollment at any accredited institution. She's 9, I said. She doesn't know any of this happened. And if I do this right, by the time she's old enough to understand it, the worst of it will be over. Sabine looked at me over the top of the document. You've never met her? No. I picked up my tea. My hands were steady. The first time in weeks I could hold a cup without feeling the tremor that came from reading my father's handwriting on evidence sleeves. But I know what it feels like to be young in that family with no one protecting your future. I know what it feels like to build something and watch it get taken because nobody thought to put a guardrail around it. Wren is going to have what I didn't. Sabine was quiet for a moment. Then she initialed the last page of the college fund, stacked it on top of the trust documents, and set both piles on the desk. Employee ownership trust on the left, Wren's college fund on the right. 2 stacks of paper. One protected 34 strangers. The other protected 1 child. Together they filled the second suitcase and answered a question I had been asking myself for a decade. What do you do with power once you have it? 2 suitcases, one full of evidence, one full of protection. Which one do you think hit harder at that dinner table? Sabine looked at me across the desk. That's everything, she said. Evidence in suitcase 1, future in suitcase 2. All that's left is the dinner. I picked up both stacks, slid them into the second suitcase's document compartment, and pressed the pages flat against the lining. The paper was heavy. Raised notary seals, embossed headers, the particular weight of documents that change ownership and redirect futures. I zipped the suitcase shut and set it on the floor beside its twin. Book me a hotel in Fort Smith, I said. Friday night. Sabine pulled up her laptop without asking which Friday. She already knew. Every document in both suitcases had been built around that date, long before my mother ever said a word about dinner. I finished my tea, set the cup down on her desk, and looked at the 2 suitcases standing side by side on the office floor. One held everything my family had done. The other held everything I had chosen to do instead. I was ready to go home. I checked into the Holiday Inn on Rogers Avenue at 4:15 on a Friday afternoon in June 2024, set both suitcases on the bed, and changed my shirt. The dinner was tomorrow evening. I had 24 hours to kill in a city I had not lived in for a decade, and I did not plan to drive past my sister's office. But the interstate exit fed onto Towson Avenue, and the route to the hotel took me past the building, and at 9:40 p.m. I saw the lights on in the second floor and pulled over. I did not get out of the car. I sat behind the wheel with the engine idling, and the rain tapping the windshield, and watched Nadine through the office window. She was thinner than the last time I had seen her, at a family gathering 4 years ago, before I stopped attending. 52 years old and hunched over a desk under fluorescent light that flickered every few seconds, alone in a building that held 34 jobs she was trying to keep alive. She picked up a phone call, listened, rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand, set the phone down, and went back to the screen. The posture of a woman holding something together with both hands and feeling it slip. She looked tired the way I used to look tired. Not from the hours, but from knowing the math does not work and doing it anyway. I recognized that hunch. I had lived in that hunch for the last 6 months before my father pulled the trigger on the convertible note. The fluorescent light caught the side of her face, and I could see the lines around her eyes that had not been there 4 years ago. You want this to be simple, do you not? Good, sister. bad sister. But when has this story ever been that clean? I turned off the engine. The rain kept tapping. The rental car smelled like synthetic air freshener and wet asphalt, and I sat in that smell and watched my sister work and tried to locate the hatred I had carried for 10 years. It was there. I could feel it, low and steady, the way you feel a bruise when you press it. She had raised her hand at that shareholder meeting. She had seen the forged letters before they were sent. Her silence on the phone had confirmed that. She had typed her name over my protocols and filed them as her own. She knew. But she had also kept 34 people employed for a decade. She had shown up every day and run a company she did not build with methods she did not invent, and held the payroll together through 3 years of declining revenue while the bank circled and Vernon offered nothing but silence from his warehouse on the other side of town. She had done that. Not well enough, not honestly, but she had done it. Rain on a windshield turns everything into a watercolor. Faces blur, edges soften, and the woman on the other side of the glass could be anyone. Could be you. Could be me if Vernon had made a different choice about which daughter to invest in and which one to discard. I sat in that car for 20 minutes. I did not open the door. I did not call her. I watched her take 2 more phone calls and drink something from a mug that was probably cold. I thought about the question I had asked her on the phone in March. Did she see the letters before or after? And the 6 seconds of silence that answered it. She knew. She participated. But did she choose it? Or did our father choose it for her, the way he chose everything for both of us? Vernon had called Nadine the real investment the day he took my company. Not because she was smarter, not because she was more capable, because she would do what she was told. And for 10 years, she had done exactly that. Managed the company he handed her, followed the protocols I had written, filed the paperwork with her name where mine had been, and never once pushed back. Not because she was evil, because compliance was the only currency our father ever accepted, and Nadine had learned to pay it before she learned to walk. Is that guilt, or is that damage? I still do not have a clean answer. I am not sure one exists. She was the tool. Our father was the hand. And tomorrow, both of them were going to sit at the same table and reckon with that. I started the car. The headlights swept across the wet pavement, and I pulled away from the curb without turning on the radio. The drive to the Holiday Inn took 7 minutes. I parked, walked to my room, and set both suitcases on the bed. Evidence on the left, future on the right. I lay down between them fully clothed, my back against the rough hotel bedspread, and stared at the ceiling. The room smelled like laundry detergent and recycled air. I had not eaten since Austin, and my stomach was knotted shut. Tomorrow was the dinner. The table on Garrison Avenue. The same chairs, the same silverware, the same family. My father would be at the head. My mother would bring the dishes from the kitchen. Nadine would sit across from me with the face I had just watched through the rain. And I still did not know what I was going to say first. I woke up between the 2 suitcases at 6 a.m. with the hotel bedspread creased into my back and the answer already in my mouth. I did not need to decide what to say first. My father would tell me himself. He always did. The Aldrich family home on Garrison Avenue smelled exactly the way I remembered. Roast, starch, and Lorraine's lavender hand soap. And for 3 seconds in the doorway, I was 12 years old again. Then Vernon cleared his throat from the head of the table, and I was 36 and carrying 10 years of evidence in the trunk of a rental car parked at the curb. Vernon waited until dessert. Lorraine's peach cobbler, the same recipe from every family dinner I had ever attended, sat in the center of the table beside a stack of clean plates. Wren Pruitt, 9 years old, sat between her parents drawing horses on a paper napkin, her crayon moving in careful loops while the adults passed dishes and said nothing of consequence. Her father, Doug Pruitt, 42, a quiet regional sales manager for a medical device company, sat at the far end of the table with the posture of a man who understood that family dinners in this house contained undercurrents he was not expected to navigate. Nadine sat across from me and did not meet my eyes once. Vernon set down his fork, cleared his throat, and said, "We need to talk about Nadine's company, the new ownership group. We were hoping you might be in a position to help." I looked at my father. 67 years old, same blocky hands that had signed the sticky note, same confident posture, same assumption that the room would arrange itself around his request. He had no idea. "You don't need to ask me to buy it, Dad," I said. "I bought it in January. Quarry Creek Holdings. That's me. I've owned it for 6 months." The silverware went still. Every fork, every knife, every hand at the table froze. Vernon's face did not move, but something behind his eyes collapsed. A structural failure, visible only to someone who had spent a lifetime reading him. Lorraine's hand went to her mouth. Nadine closed her eyes. I opened the first suitcase on my mother's dining table, right next to the peach cobbler. Nobody touched dessert after that. I laid out the evidence the way I had rehearsed it. Chronological, clinical, without raising my voice. The 40 forged letters, the sticky note in his handwriting, the envelopes in my mother's cursive, Howard's notarized testimony. Leland Hatch's letter confirming the predatory terms were deliberate. I placed each item on the table and named it, and I watched my family look at the pieces of what they had done, arranged beside the cobbler and the clean plates and the napkin where Wren was still drawing horses. "I have all of it," I said, "and I am not using any of it to destroy you. I am using it to make sure you never do this to anyone again." I opened the second suitcase. The Employee Ownership Trust, Wren's college fund. I signed both documents at the table with a pen I had carried from Austin, slid the pen to Nadine, and waited. "The 34 employees own the company now," I said. "Wren has a college fund no one at this table can touch, and Nadine keeps her 30%, if the employee board votes to keep her. That is not my call anymore." Nadine picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking. She signed without reading the documents, and I did not stop her because Sabine had already reviewed every clause and Nadine's signature was a formality, not a negotiation. Doug put his arm around Wren and pulled her gently against his side. Vernon said nothing. He stared at the sticky note on the table, his own handwriting, his own initials, and he said nothing at all. I stood up. I had not touched my plate. I had not eaten the cobbler. I walked to the front porch, and the screen door closed behind me, and the evening air hit my face, and I breathed. Lorraine followed me out. She stood on the porch in the lavender soap quiet and said the first words she had spoken to me all night. "Why couldn't you just let us have this? We're your family." 4 words, 10 years, and still not one of them was sorry. "That's the first thing you've said to me tonight, Mom," I told her. "And it's still not an apology." I drove back to the Holiday Inn. I sat on the bed in the room that smelled like laundry detergent and opened my phone and left the family group chat. I did not block anyone. Blocking is a wall. Leaving is a door you choose not to walk through anymore. 3 months later, in August 24, the employee board voted to rename the company. Nadine kept her position, on merit, not on inheritance. Wren's fund grew independently in an Austin trust account, beyond anyone's reach. Vernon told a different version of the story at the golf course. Lorraine never called, and every first Tuesday of the month, I stand in front of a whiteboard that still carries the blue ghost of a number I wrote 3 years ago. A pale shadow of 2 digits that will not fully erase no matter how many times I wipe the surface. I teach a free class for women who are starting over with nothing. I tell them the same thing every time. The most valuable thing you will ever build is not a company. It is the proof that you can build it again. That is how this story ends, not with a verdict, but with a class. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 10 years carrying anger like a second heartbeat. I let it sharpen me, and I am grateful for that. It built a company worth more than anything my father ever touched. But I also let it hollow me out in places I did not notice, until the night I sat alone drafting a revenge story against my own family and realized the document tasted like poison. My mistake was believing that proving them wrong and healing were the same thing. They are not. Do not make that mistake. If there is one lesson I want you to carry from this revenge story, it is this. Justice does not require destruction. You can hold people accountable without becoming the thing that hurt you. You can reclaim what was stolen without burning down everything around it. The hardest part of my revenge story was not buying the company back or finding the evidence. It was choosing to delete the memo, protect 34 strangers, and fund a college account for a 9-year-old girl who never asked to be born into this. I believe God put me through those 10 years for a reason. Not to punish my family, but to teach me that real strength is knowing you have the match and choosing not to strike it. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me, was I right to delete that memo, or would you have sent it? Share this with someone who needs to hear that walking away from revenge is not the same as walking away from justice. And if you have not already, subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Please remember that some details in this story were fictionalized for narrative purposes.